The night of March 26, 1945, was cold and moonless over central Germany. A column of 57 vehicles rolled east along blackout roads at 15 miles per hour. No headlights, engines grinding through the dark, crews watching for the first flash of enemy fire. 16 Sherman tanks, 28 half-tracks, 13 jeeps, 314 men. They were heading 50 miles behind German lines. The man who sent them was General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, one of the most aggressive armored commanders the war had produced. By late March 1945, Patton had pushed farther and faster across France and Germany than almost any Allied commander on the Western Front. He understood armor, logistics, and tempo in ways that repeatedly broke German defenses before they could stabilize. His Third Army had crossed the Rhine. Germany was cracking. The momentum was his. And yet, somewhere in that column moving east through the dark, something was wrong. The official order was to liberate approximately 300 American officers held at a prisoner of war camp called Oflag 13B near the Bavarian town of Hammelburg. The conditions in the camp were reported as brutal: starvation rations, freezing temperatures, men too weak to stand. The liberation was framed as a humanitarian strike, fast and deep, in and out before the Germans could react. But most historians who have examined the record believe there was a second reason. Among the prisoners at Hammelburg was Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, captured in Tunisia in February 1943 and married to Patton's eldest daughter, Beatrice. 3 days before the task force departed, Patton wrote to his wife, "We are heading right for John's camp." He also sent his personal aide, Major Alexander Stiller, on the mission, an officer with no tactical role, but someone who could recognize Waters on sight. Whether Patton knew with certainty that his son-in-law was there or acted on strong probability is a question historians still debate. What is not debated is the outcome. This is not a story about a brilliant trap that worked. It is the story of what happens when one of the war's best commanders allowed personal stakes to override every tactical principle he had spent a career building, and what 300 men paid for that decision. The force leading the mission was commanded by Captain Abraham Baum, the operations officer of the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, 4th Armored Division. Baum was exactly the kind of officer Patton's Third Army had built: aggressive, experienced, capable under pressure. When Patton's 12th Corps commander, Major General Manton Eddy, received the order to organize the task force, he reportedly objected. The penetration distance was 50 miles. There was no support force staged to follow. No air cover had been allocated. Fuel for the entire operation was carried in jerry cans loaded onto a single half-track. Eddy believed the force was far too small for what was being asked of it. Patton overruled him. The mission was assigned to Baum. On a map, the plan looked like a deep armored raid, the kind of fast, unsupported thrust that Patton had used before to exploit disorganized enemy rear areas. From the current front line near Aschaffenburg, Baum's column would drive east across open German-held territory, cross the Saale River at the town of Gemünden, continue southeast toward Hammelburg, break open the camp, load the prisoners, and return. The German rear areas were fragmented in late March 1945. Rear echelon troops, convalescent units, training schools. Not frontline strength. That assessment was not entirely wrong, but it was dangerously incomplete. The column departed on the night of March 26th under blackout conditions. Baum directed his drivers to knock down telephone poles along the route to slow German communications. But the wires were cut, not destroyed, and news of the breach moved faster than the column. By the time the task force reached the town of Fraunhofen in the early morning hours, white sheets were already hanging from windows. The Germans ahead knew something was coming. The first serious ambush struck near Hulrich. Veterans from the German Infantry Combat School at Hammelburg, NCO instructors, officer cadets, not green recruits, had set up a blocking position in the dark. A Panzerfaust hit the lead vehicle. Then, the Germans pulled off a move that showed exactly how capable these improvised defenders were. They captured an American Sherman tank, drove it into position, and began answering the task force's radio calls in English, luring other tanks forward into the kill zone. 4 Shermans were destroyed in that engagement. Baum pulled back, reorganized, and turned north to find an alternate route. The bigger problem was waiting at Gemünden. The Saale River ran directly across the task force's path, and Gemünden was the crossing point. What Baum did not know, what no one in the planning process had apparently confirmed, was that Gemünden was an active German infantry assembly area, a rail junction point still functioning and defended. When the task force arrived at the river, it ran directly into concentrated resistance. The Germans blew the bridge as the Americans began to cross. Multiple men were killed and wounded. 3 more tanks were lost. During the fight for the crossing, an infantry platoon and the task force's reconnaissance platoon were both captured. Baum was left with a shrunken, damaged force on the wrong side of the river, a destroyed bridge, and no way forward through Gemünden. He turned north, searching for an alternate crossing at Rieneck, then at Bergesen, adding miles, adding time, and burning through the fuel that was already dangerously limited. The German net was beginning to tighten. Outside Bergesen, Baum captured SS General Oriel Lotz and 2 staff officers. He handed them over to 700 Russian prisoners his men had freed along the route, liberated workers who had no capacity to hold a German general. Lotz escaped. Within hours, he had reached a telephone and reported what he knew to German command: the composition of the task force, its direction of travel, and its apparent destination. A German spotter aircraft had already picked up the column near Weikersgruben after the river crossing, circling above and radioing the task force's position back to German controllers. Now, the Germans had enough information to act. SS officer cadets were redirected to blocking positions north of the camp. A Panzerjäger battalion, anti-tank specialists, began moving to cover the approach routes. An assault gun battalion deployed south of Hill, 427, establishing an overwatch position. These were not elite armored units, but they were organized, they were armed, and they knew exactly where the column was going. Baum's force reached O-Flag 13B on the afternoon of March 27th, more than 24 hours after departing, battered by ambushes, short on fuel, short on men, with an enemy now fully aware of its presence, and closing in from multiple directions. What waited inside the camp was not what the mission had planned for. The prisoner population had swollen well beyond early estimates. Forced marches from camps in Poland through a brutal winter had pushed the numbers at Hammelburg to over 1,400 American officers and several thousand Serbian officers. Many were in desperate physical condition, months of starvation rations, the aftermath of a winter march hundreds of miles long. The camp commander, General Günther von Guckel, was still holding the perimeter with his guards when T.F. Baum arrived. For 2 hours, Baum's men exchanged fire with the German defenders, but could not immediately breach the gates. Guckel then made an unexpected request. He called for Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters to come forward, asking him to act as an intermediary to negotiate a truce and explain the American presence. Waters volunteered. He and several others walked out of the camp toward the American lines to communicate with the approaching task force. A German soldier who had not received the message, or had not stopped fighting, saw them and fired. Waters was hit near the spine. He fell, seriously wounded, and could not be moved. He was carried back inside the camp. The man the mission may have been designed to rescue was out of reach before Baum's men had even fully broken through the wire. Baum pushed through the perimeter. The gates came down. Prisoners flooded out into the open. And then the mission's deepest flaw became impossible to ignore. Task Force Baum had arrived at O-Flag 13B with exactly enough vehicle space for its own crew. It had brought no additional transport. No plan existed for moving 1,400 starving, weakened men 50 miles west through German-held territory. Hundreds of prisoners climbed onto tanks, crammed into half-tracks, tried to walk alongside the column. Many were too weak to stand. The force that was supposed to strike hard and move fast was suddenly carrying a crowd it could not feed, could not protect, and could not leave behind. The Serbian doctor inside the camp treated both Waters, too wounded to travel, and Baum himself, who had taken wounds during the fighting at the perimeter. Baum reorganized what remained of his column and sent Lieutenant Nutto north to probe the return route. The probe ran directly into an ambush at Hesdorf. SS officer cadets had established blocking positions there, reinforced by 5 Tiger tanks. 3 more Shermans were destroyed. Nutto was wounded. The northern escape route was closed. Baum pulled the remnants of the task force to a defensive position at Hill 427 in the early hours of March 28th. The fuel was nearly gone. The vehicles that remained were damaged. The German forces that had been converging since Lotz escaped were now closing in from multiple directions. From the north, where the SS cadets and Tiger tanks held the road. From the south, where the assault gun battalion sat in overwatch below the hill. From the east, where the camp had been. The 50 miles back to Patton's lines stretched behind them empty of any friendly force, any support column, any aircraft. There was no one coming. At Hill 427, the encirclement completed itself. German forces closed in, and the task force was overrun. The column disintegrated. Baum made it into the woods on foot before a German soldier shot him in the groin, and he was captured. He was brought back to Hammelburg, the camp his task force had reached and broken open, where the same Serbian doctor who had treated Waters now treated him. Of the 314 men who had departed on the night of March 26th, approximately 32 were killed. The vast majority of the rest were captured. Only 35 men made it back to Allied-controlled territory. Every one of the 57 tanks, half-tracks, and vehicles was destroyed or taken. 9 days later, on April 6, 1945, Combat Command B of the 14th Armored Division liberated OFLAG 13B. It was the full armored force that Manton Eddy and his commanders had said was needed from the beginning. It reached the camp without the losses Task Force Baum had suffered. Waters was evacuated, recovered from his wound, and eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant general. The camp the small task force had tried to reach at enormous cost was freed by a proper force in a matter of days. Patton attempted to suppress news of the raid. It leaked anyway, as these things always do. He visited Baum in the hospital and pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on his hospital gown, promoting him to major. Patton later wrote in his memoir that throughout the campaign in Europe, the only error he could identify was failing to send a full combat command to take Hammelburg. He framed the failure as a resourcing problem, a force too small, not an objective too personal. Most military historians who have examined the record do not accept that framing entirely. The U.S. Army Armor Analysis published in 2018 identifies the raid as a case study in what happens when deep penetration operations are launched without engineer assets for river crossings, without sufficient fuel transport, without medical resources for a liberated prisoner population, and without a follow-on force staged to support or extract the raiding party. Every one of those missing elements was a standard requirement for the type of operation Patton had just ordered. Every one of those requirements had been set aside. What makes this episode so striking is precisely that Patton understood these requirements better than almost anyone. Speed, logistics, concentration of force, clear operational objectives. These were the principles that had driven his Third Army across hundreds of miles of France and Germany. At Hammelburg, those principles were abandoned at the moment they were most needed. The Germans did not need brilliance to destroy Task Force Baum. They needed only time, information, and a road network, all of which they had. There is no map-driven revelation here, no hidden reserve emerging at the decisive moment, no enemy assumption reversed by a commander who read the terrain better than his opponent. The ambushes at Hellrich and Gemminden were not brilliant German strokes. They were the predictable result of a small force moving deep into enemy territory without concealment, without support, and without contingency. When Lotz escaped and made his phone call, The column's fate was already being organized along every road back to friendly lines. Baum executed the mission with everything he had. The soldiers of Task Force Baum fought through ambush after ambush, crossed rivers under fire, reached the camp, and broke through the wire. The failure was not theirs. The failure belonged to the decision that put them there. A decision made in the knowledge that the numbers were wrong, that the distance was too far, that the force was too small, and that the gap between personal urgency and operational reality had been crossed. Patton later called it his only error. The men who did not come home from Hill 427 paid for it first.